Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on culture in the service of nationhood. I've got a couple of things that I want to talk to you about before we really get rolling on this lecture. The idea here, in the way that this is organized, is to talk a little bit about some artists who are involved in paintings and sculptures, basically in the last kind of quarter of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century, who had primarily, although not exclusively, adopted a particular style from Europe, a neoclassical style, which in England at the time, which is basically where they're drawing most directly from, was known as the grand manner. It's a classical style, and so we'll go into classical aesthetics a lot today, and I'll give you an explanation for why that's going to be the case here in a moment. But I wanted to give you kind of the wider narrative arc of today's lecture so that you can understand how this fits into the context of the time. As the United States was being founded following the American Revolution, there was a big search for imagery that would promote the idea of what this great nation was going to be. As I said in last lecture, at this point in time, really in colonial America, before the Revolution, the primary art form, at least art form being produced by American artists, was portraiture, right? There wasn't very much else out there. But around the time that, of course, we come together as a nation, and a little bit before this with artists who had traveled to Europe, there was a move afoot that was interested in promoting culture in colonial America. And then after, of course, the American Revolution, there's an even greater push to come up with imagery that's appropriate to, for instance, heroizing various characters. You see George Washington, for instance, here in this cover image, or heroizing various war scenes from the American Revolution. So, in other words, when a nation first comes together, there's an interest in trying to determine what types of imagery, and in particular how this imagery is going to be represented, that will say, here's who we are. This is what we believe in. These are our great leaders. These are the great battles that founded this nation, and so forth. Now, at the time in Europe that this is all happening, so basically we're going to start with a little bit before the American Revolution and then run through the beginning of the 19th century, the primary art form of that time was classical aesthetics. Now, classical aesthetics and classicism is what we call a trans-historical style. A trans-historical style, unlike a period style that we talked about in the first introductory lecture, is a style that crops up over and over again throughout history. Classicism is the best example of this. I think when someone says classical music, we all understand, generally speaking, what they're talking about. Now, of course, classical music has been produced since, the Renaissance at least forward, and not all classical music is the same, but it shares some of the same characteristics. In visual arts, the first classical moment in time was classical Greece, so sometime in the 5th century BCE, all those sculptures you're so familiar with, which, by the way, happen to be Roman copies of Greek originals, all of that architecture. And then Greece, of course, collapses under the weight of their expansionist policies under Alexander the Great, but classicism or classical aesthetics is revived by the Romans, who loved everything Roman. So we see an early historical moment in Greece, and then of course that culture goes away, and another culture adopts the same aesthetics, roughly the same aesthetics as that earlier culture. And then Rome, of course, collapses under its own colonial expansion empire building, goes away. We have the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance, revives classical aesthetics. Renaissance, by the way, literally means rebirth. And when they say rebirth, they mean the rebirth of classical aesthetics. And then it kind of goes away a little bit. It's in the background of a lot of Baroque works of art from, again, we're talking about, you don't need to remember any of these dates, but for those of you who care about a timeline, at this point we're talking about, the big burst of classicism in the Renaissance is really in the 1400s through the early 1500s, and then the Baroque period starts somewhere around 1600 or so, maybe a little bit before that. And in the Baroque period, there are various artists who are still, using classical aesthetics at the basis of their work, particularly in France. But then we have another moment in time where classical aesthetics reasserts itself, especially at the end of the 18th century, all the way through the 19th century in Europe. The biggest game in town, the most accepted art form, was based upon classical aesthetics. In France, the style is usually known as neoclassicism or academic classicism. And when we go to England, which is more in line with American art, because a lot of, as I said last time, American artists are traveling to England to study under, in particular, Benjamin West. The English call this neoclassical style the grand manner. So unlike many moments in this class where we don't really talk about style and we don't really talk about these larger kind of stylistic questions, because classical aesthetics are so pervasive, and because I think it's useful for you to know the ins and outs of, on the one hand, what the aesthetic philosophy of classicism is, why it arrived at this moment and was so popular in Europe and then was attempted to be transported to the U.S. You're going to find out it didn't work very well. And what classical aesthetics look like in terms of their formal qualities. I'm going to spend some time on this, and your summary essay is going to be based on this week. So, carrying on with this narrative arc, again, just to give you a kind of preview, a number of the artists that you're going to see traveled to Europe. There wasn't any infrastructure in the United States to teach them painting at any kind of sophisticated level. They go to Europe, they train a little bit, most of them under this famous American artist Benjamin West that we'll start our lecture off with today. They gain some understanding of classical aesthetics, they get some basics on, the technique of painting, and they try to transport that grand manner style to the United States with limited success. Sorry to give you the punchline in a way, or to let you know kind of where this goes in advance. Spoiler alert. A lot of these artists didn't gain a foothold in the United States because a lot of infighting around what classicism represented, what it was valuable for, whether it was too European, whether it was too elitist. Those are all questions that confronted this style of painting when it was attempted to be kind of imported to the United States. So we do have some major examples of paintings, but frankly, the American public and the government, which was oftentimes supposedly commissioning these works of art only to later refuse the commission, didn't really support it very much. But again, the reason I want to talk about it is it's an important moment in American history, and it will give you some kind of basis in classical aesthetics, which you can apply to a ton of things. These basic ideas are at play to some degree with slight modifications in some Greek art, some Roman art, lots of Renaissance art, lots of art of the later Baroque period in France and beyond. So let's start with our first major artist. Again, remember to download your lecture guide, have that available to you so that you can follow along with me. The first artist that we're looking at is Benjamin West. Benjamin West, you've heard his name a lot already at this point, was born in Pennsylvania. He showed a decent amount of promise as a young man. He aspired to be a painter, and you see one of his earliest paintings here. This is called Landscape with Cow. And he did it when he was in his early teens. He realized pretty quickly, however, that if he wanted to be an ambitious painter staying in the United States where there was no real schools, no real patronage, just wasn't going to work for him. So in 1759, he left to go to England. He settled in England right around the same time period that England was developing what's known as a Royal Academy to the Arts. Let me just say this before I go ahead. This is just an example of an early portrait he did right before he left of Dr. Samuel Baude. This is what he would have done for the remainder of his career had he stayed in the United States. It's a decent portrait, right? But he's going to do something like this over and over again. So he basically jumps ship and goes to England. When he goes to England, as I was saying, England started and had always been kind of in competition with France. They're their major rivals for ages. England was starting what's known as a Royal Academy to the Arts. These Royal Academies had started in the first place about 100 years before this, in the middle of the 17th century in France under the reign of Louis XIV. Who established this big institution. Again, the French Royal Academy to the Arts, like Royal Academies after it, and that in England 100 years later, has a number of things going for it. First and foremost, it's a teaching academy. So master artists are available for a fee, and if you're good enough, for you to learn through. And these master artists are all, to some degree, beholden to the same aesthetic philosophy. This is a term you're going to hear a lot today. An aesthetic philosophy is basically the conceptual underpinnings of a style, the rationale for what a style is, like what it's supposed to do, and why it's better than other ways to produce art. I'll go into that in a bit. So the French Royal Academy starts first in 1642. Under Louis XIV, major painters, for those of you who have taken classes on this before, like Nicolas Poussin, are extolling the virtues of a very specific classical aesthetic philosophy. In England, then, to jump forward, about 100 years later, right a little bit after the time that Benjamin West shows up in London, a man by the name of Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president of the English Royal Academy, and George III, and later on, Benjamin West, who becomes the second president of this Royal Academy, establish a similar academy in England. Again, on the one hand, what this academy does is it teaches people what great art is supposed to be and gives them that aesthetic philosophy. It is also teaching technique. So how do you paint at this time? How do you actually do or manifest this aesthetic philosophy in paintings and in sculptures? And to do that, you would apprentice to a master artist and learn from them a long period of time, a long, very strenuous tutelage. But beyond that, there's another really important component to Royal Academies, and that's that they hold annual or every other year exhibitions known as the Salon. Salon is a term adopted from the French Royal Academy, but the British used it as well. It means these giant exhibitions, and the way that this would work is every year, every couple of years, all artists who were ambitious would submit their best works to these exhibitions, these salons. These works wouldn't be accepted necessarily. They would have to pass through a jury of master artists who would look at them and judge them based upon how well they fulfilled these criteria that are part of the aesthetic philosophy of the grand manner style. If they seemed good enough, they would go into the exhibitions, be hung on the walls, and be awarded prizes depending upon, again, how great people thought that these works of art were. And by people, I mean a jury of peers, a jury of master artists, a jury of people who were connoisseurs and collectors and so forth. So that In Europe, classicism is a very accepted, very conventional style. Everyone likes it because it's shown up in, at the heart of these great earlier nations, Greece and of course Rome and the Renaissance, right? Who doesn't like that stuff? And it's the biggest thing going on. One of the reasons that it gets so popular at this particular time in England, part of the context, however, is that during this time period, people began to, first of all, there was a systematic excavation of Herculaneum and Pompeii, which are two Roman cities from Roman times that were covered in volcanic ash and almost perfectly preserved. And when these were excavated, people had known about them for a long time, by the way, but as they were systematically excavated, more and more information about the classical world was emerging in Europe, and this created a real interest in the classical world. It was also the case at this time that if you were of the upper middle class and above, it was almost mandatory that you would go on what's called the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour would be something that, it didn't matter what your age was. It kind of depended on what your wealth was. You would go on a long trip, up to 2-3 years, traveling through various sites in Europe, most of which had some connection to the ancient classical world. So, for instance, a major destination for people on the Grand Tour was Athens. A major destination was also Rome. So you go to these centers of classical activity of the ancient past, and you would basically learn about classical ideas, classical arts, and so forth. And this fostered a great interest in classicism. Further, you should just know that to be an educated person at this time, it was almost, without exception, mandatory that you learn Latin, that you learn the stories and history of Greece and of Rome and of the Renaissance. It was part of just a general understanding in Europe at this time that to be a member of the kind of middle upper class, you should have this kind of education and be interested in classical ideas. So, this sets the stage then for the emergence of classicism in England in the middle of the 18th century, and that will be at least attempted to be transported to the Americas. So let's start with some of the aesthetic philosophy of classical aesthetics. Aesthetic philosophy is the study or understanding of beauty. And in this case, what we mean by aesthetic philosophy is what is the conceptual rationale for why an artist paints or sculpts the way that they do. Now, this aesthetic philosophy is much more complex than I'm going to give you today, but I'm going to give you the basics of it. Going back to what you see on the screen here in front of you, what is known as the Platonic triangle. Write this down, the Platonic triangle. See, classical aesthetics goes all the way back to Plato, and while I'm not going to rehearse Plato's philosophy here at length, what I do want you to know is that for ancient Greece, if someone were able to create something that was perfectly beautiful, it would also necessarily be instilled with truth and with goodness. In other words, the Platonic triangle says that these three terms are mutually inclusive. You cannot have one without the other. So that if I represent something as perfectly beautiful, it must also be filled with truth and goodness. In other words, beauty, the ideal beauty, in particular of male bodies, is something that is filled with truth and goodness. Now, for Plato, the reason for this is that he believed in a realm of forms, a realm that was beyond this phenomenal realm that we all lived in, that was filled with universal truths and with goodness, and beauty was tied to those. Now, I could go into this in more detail, but let me cut to the chase here. During the time of the Renaissance, in particularly Italy, the Italian Renaissance, ideas that were taken from classical philosophy, such as Plato and Aristotle in particular, got blended together with Christian theology, and this form of philosophy was known as Neoplatonism, New Platonism. Now, this is what's most important for us in understanding why artists and the public believed that there was a connection between the beautiful and truth. It goes like this. In this diagram I have up here, of course, most of these people, certainly during the Italian Renaissance and in the time period that we're talking about, were deeply Christian. And they believed, as Christians all believe, that God exists in heaven and that he is perfect, right? He's all-knowing, he's all-powerful. In the realm of heaven, everything that exists there is universal, timeless, and transcendent. Universality means it's true for all people in all times, regardless of their gender, their ethnicity, even their religious affiliation, right? It's an idea that something is true for all people in all times and all places. Because Christians believe that God, being perfect and all-powerful, created this world, right? And that he further created us, human beings, in his image. It just stands to reason, according to this idea of God as the divine craftsman, that because this world was made by God, there must be something of his perfection in this world, and because we're made in his image, there must be something of his perfection in us as well. Therefore, if you think about this historically, who showed you God's perfection in our world? Who tried to explain to you God's will or God's desire for us in this world? And traditionally, it had always been the clergy, right? Priests, pastors, and so forth, trying to tell you, here's what God wants from you, here's what God's plan is, and so forth, in the best way that they could determine that. During the time period of the Renaissance, particularly in the late 1400s, during what we call the High Renaissance, artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and to a little bit lesser extent Raphael, argued that artists were basically like middlemen, mediators, or revealers of God, that they had images, perfect images inspired by God, kind of divinely inspired, as we say, placed in their head, and then they went about creating perfect works of art so as to reveal God to us. Or another way to put this is, if we look around our world, our phenomenal realm, we might not see God's perfection in that world. Traditionally, the priests, the Pope and so forth, cardinals, were supposed to be showing us God's perfection in the world. But during the time of the Renaissance artists started saying, I can see God's perfection in the world, or God has inspired me to see his perfection in the world. And what they went about doing is creating ideal, perfect pictures, paintings, sculptures, and so forth, with the idea being that if you created a perfect, idealized painting or sculpture, that was the closest thing to a representation of God that you could have in our material world. So that if you came into contact with, let's say, Michelangelo's David, and you looked at that ideal human form, you would say, this is humans made in God's image. This is God-like. Now, further, of course, they believed that anything that was God-like was also truthful and also good. And so the idea was that by creating works of art that reflected God's perfection in the world, we were brought into proximity with both God and with truth and with goodness, and would basically make the world a better place. That's the basis of this aesthetic philosophy. Now, the trick, of course, in some of this is, what do we mean by beauty? How do you create perfect beauty? The main one, the big one, over and over again, was this belief that the human form, in particular the nude male form, was in the image of God if it was made ideally. And idealism didn't just mean something like something subjective. It didn't mean, for instance, in today's world, you might look around and look at some really beautiful man and say, wow, that guy's really good looking. Let's use him as, the ideal type. More often than not, what Renaissance artists did and classically inspired artists did was maybe they would be inspired by real beauty in the world. That's absolutely true. But they would submit that beauty to a what's known as a canon of perfect proportions. In other words, you would look at the human form and you'd say, let's say you're looking at a live model and you'd say, that's a really beautiful figure. I don't know who everyone's eye candy is these days, but let's say it's, I don't know, Chris Hemsworth or something. Ryan Gosling. You look at him, you're like, good looking guy, but not perfect. So what the artist does is take that body, take that facial structure, and submit it to a canon of proportions, which is a series of ratios in the body, in which, for instance, one of the standard ones is that the distance between the tip of a finger and its first digit, and that distance's ratio to the overall finger, which is roughly a little over 3 to 1, will be a ratio that shows up over and over again in the body. For instance, that ratio, 3 to 1, 3 of this distance to the entire finger is the same ratio as the entire hand to the arm and the foot to the leg. Or another ratio system was 7 heads to a body, right? The distance from here to here will show up 7 times in the entire body and so forth. In other words, you submit what you see to a rational, almost mathematical ideal. Here are some other things that to be aware of in classical aesthetics or stylistics. Style is, of course, as I said on the first day, a series of, it starts with this premise. Because these artists in a particular place at a particular time are all influenced by what's going on in the world, and in particular by aesthetic norms in that world, right? What people think is good art, they will tend to produce works of art that share in common various kind of general characteristics. So stylistics here are some of those general characteristics premised upon visual form. In classical aesthetics, then, this aesthetic philosophy shows up in works of art in terms of, first and foremost, every work of art that is inspired by classicism does not seek to represent something realistically or even naturalistically, right? Looking like nature, looking exactly like things that are in the real world. It tries to submit what it sees in nature to an ideal. The goal is not to create something realistic. It's to make it better than realistic, to make it idealistic. And the reason for this, as I've just said, is that ideals are reflections of God and beauty and truth and goodness in our material world. Another big idea in classical aesthetics is unity. Now, unity is a really complex term, so I'm just going to keep it simple for the purposes of this intro art history class. Unity is the idea that in a work of art, all the parts of the work of art, a painting or a sculpture, add up to a whole, in the sense that nothing can be imagined to be added to a painting or sculpture, or nothing subtracted. Or another way to put this, since it's a writing course, is to think about unity in terms of the way that a paper should be written. You have a thesis in that paper, right? And that thesis, or the main argument of the paper, governs what should be included in a paper and what shouldn't be included in a paper. So if you're filling up a paper full of things that don't support your thesis, those are not useful, get rid of them. If you haven't added enough information to your paper so as to support your thesis, then you have to go add things. A perfect paper then would be unified around that thesis, right? So that you could imagine nothing more being added or nothing subtracted. One of the big series of watchwords in classical stylistics are rationality, clarity, and order, that are all very related terms. Classical works of art are meant to appeal to your mind, to your intellect, not your subjective, sensual part of yourself. To go back to that example, for instance, of Michelangelo's David, that is a really beautiful sculpture, no question about it. Beautiful body, I don't mind saying. That doesn't matter what your sexuality is, that's a beautiful darn body. But it's supposedly, according to classical aesthetics, I am not supposed to look at that body and say, oh my God, where can I meet that guy, right? What I'm supposed to be thinking is, holy moly, that is the most beautiful body I've ever seen. It's perfectly proportionate. It's in the image of God. You can kind of hear the angels singing. In other words, it's not meant to be sensual. It might be sensual, but its main goal, supposedly, is to not be sensual at all, to just appeal to your intellect. And I think we all know this, right? Many of you will know, at least I know, and maybe this is too much information, but I want to make sure we all get this, that you can look at some people and just think, wow, what a beautiful person, right? Perfectly symmetrical, beautiful spacing of the eyes, perfect proportionality and so forth. And they don't really hit you sensually, if you know what I mean. It's just kind of like, wow, that's a really perfect looking person. Whereas sensuality, that kind of urge, that desire that comes along with sexuality and sensuality and so forth, is something that may not be perfect at all. You might see someone who looks kind of odd and you're still like, wow, there's something about them. My point here is to say, works of art are supposed to appeal to the intellect, not the sensual side of us. Appeal to the mind, not our emotions, because they mimic God's order. How do you then create rational, clear, ordered works of art? Well, the first one I already told you, and I didn't add it on this little thing, but you should be aware of it. Canons of proportions, perfect proportionality of the human body, right? Number 2, perspectival systems, linear 1 and 2 point perspective, which are like mathematical systems that govern, spatial relationships. And because they're almost mathematical, are systematic and rational, and again, mimic God's order. Like I said on the first day, classical works of art create clear distinctions between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Everything is very tightly organized, and sometimes you'll hear this called the Renaissance law of thirds or the classical law of thirds, where every little section of a work of art could be divided into thirds and further subdivided into thirds. And within those thirds, everything will be tightly organized and balanced and compositionally symmetrical and so forth. Now, there's no reason that this should be the case, frankly, but especially during the Italian Renaissance, artists argued that line, or what Italians call disegno, appealed to the mind, whereas colors or loose brushstrokes, things that were painterly, meaning they look kind of fuzzy, appealed to the emotions. And so an emphasis on line, because supposedly it appeals to the mind, is something that you see in a lot of works of art. What I mean by this is very sharp, hard contour lines in particular. Finally, a big idea in producing rationality and clarity and order are very stable compositions. Composition, again, is the arrangement of objects, figures, and so forth in a painting or a sculpture. In classical works of art, they tend to emphasize stable compositions such as pyramidal forms, which are basically three-dimensional triangular forms, or horizontals and verticals. A lot of this has to do with the way that we perceive those as being stable, right? A very wide base on a pyramidal form doesn't look like it's going to move around. Horizontals and verticals are things that we're really familiar with. We are vertical beings against a horizontal ground plane, so it's a really familiar feeling to us. Just to give you a contrast, if a composition is set up on diagonals, right, they're going to imply movement and feel less stable to us. Finally, a couple of more things. Most classical works of art emphasize balance in their composition and oftentimes symmetry. The difference between these two terms is something can be, well, symmetrical is the easy one. Symmetry means mirror images, something that basically is the same on both sides of a center axis. Balance just means that you have equal visual weight. So it might be a big, huge tree over here and a bunch of smaller trees over here. They're not the same, they don't kind of mirror each other, but they balance each other out. And then finally, colors. In most classical works of art, there's an emphasis on analogous colors, colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. Remember, complementary colors, which are across from each other on a color wheel, will really intensify each other. We don't want that in classical works of art. We want them to harmonize. So you put colors that are next to each other on a color wheel, or you use a lot of primary colors, reds and yellows and blues, just very kind of bold primaries because they're very easily understandable. I'm going to pause here for a minute, but I'll be right back. Okay, so then a few more thoughts on this before we get going. We're going to be talking here a little bit about, before we look at Benjamin West's work, about that neoclassical style known as the grand manner in England, and take you through the basic criteria by which, or the things that you'll want to look for in the grand manner style. Your summary essay for this week is going to be asking you to pick one of the two works that I'm going to talk about next as your example to explain the grand manner style, or how those works are excellent examples of the grand manner style. And so let me take you through a few more things to be thinking about here. According to, again, the aesthetic criteria set in the academic salon in England at the time, the English Royal Academy as it was called, all great works of art have to have these four qualities to them. The first is, and the starting point for all great art is, it must have a grand subject. This is what gives the grand manner its name in the first place. A grand subject at this time period was considered to be what was known as history painting. History painting meant religious painting. It meant scenes from ancient Greece or ancient Rome, sometimes mythological subjects. In general, what a grand subject meant was something that had a lot of gravitas, right? Something that was profoundly and universally important to human beings. You couldn't, for instance, start with a subject that was less than grand and think that you were going to create a great work of art. If I said, wow, you know what I really want to do is paint a scene of the forest, a classical artist would say that's not a grand subject. A forest is part of a grand subject, but it's not the subject. Or if I said, you know what a great subject would be, I want to paint a still life, which is a conglomeration of objects set on a table and lit in a particular way. And the classical artist would say, no, that's basically a study exercise. In other words, the grand manner had at its very start a hierarchy of what was considered to be great subjects. If you're going to be an ambitious artist, you had to start with a great subject. Number two, which we've just been talking about, so I'm not going to go into it in any further detail, but that grand subject has to be idealized, right? The idealization of the subject, meaning rendering it according to those classical stylistics that we've just gone into, is fundamental to creating a great work of art. Number three, we haven't talked about this yet, but most classical works of art, and certainly art of the grand manner style, has in it a moral message, right? Its concept, or the basic idea that it's wanting to communicate to us. And we'll see that as we look at these works of art. Finally, and a little tricky to explain without an example, but I'll get to this in a minute, especially in England at the time, with the rise of a study of ancient classical styles. For instance, the systematic excavation of Herculaneum in Pompeii is kind of the earliest form of archaeology, and people are really studying this stuff in depth, and artists are going out and trying to copy the ancient classical world. Being archaeologically accurate in your paintings, in as much as that was possible, was something that a lot of these artists try to achieve. And the way that they do that is they attempt to copy early classical works of art, or incorporate, kind of almost Photoshop in a sense, through painting, classical works of art in their own works of art. This will make more sense when I give you an example. So then finally on to the art, But again, these aesthetic philosophies are something that you'll find in lots of classical works of art. And once you know these ideas, it's really easy to apply them to lots of different paintings from, again, Greece, from Rome, from the Italian Renaissance in particular, all through history, and see these principles at work. That's why we're spending so much time with it. So here's the first of our two major examples of Benjamin West's painting. It's a work that has a incredibly long and complicated title. It's called Agrippina Landing at Brundisium with the Ashes of Germanicus. Right? I always threaten my students in face-to-face classes with asking this on an exam just so they groan over having to memorize that title. Remember, at this time, people would have said, well, I know what this is all about because I've studied ancient Rome, so I know the story of Agrippina, but I'll get to that in a minute. Let me set this up for you. This is what's known as a masterpiece. We use that term all the time these days just to refer to great works of art, but a masterpiece is actually historically the final major work of art that an artist creates when he is or she is ready to leave the master's studio. So they produce what today you would think of as like a thesis or a dissertation. This is their form of that. This is the work that signals to the public and to their master, I'm a master in my own right. I don't need any more schooling from you. I'm going to break out into the world, right? That's what a masterpiece means. When Benjamin West was coming up with this, he actually consulted a lot of people about a subject. And this is the subject they determined to paint. And I'll get into that in a minute. What is this subject then? It comes from ancient Rome. And the story goes like this. Germanicus was a very famous and very powerful Roman general. He was very popular. There's a lot of fear in Rome itself that he would come back into Rome and take over Rome. This was kind of the nature of the Roman Empire, even going back to Republican times, that powerful generals would take over, because they had a big army behind them, they had the populace behind them, and so forth. Now, whether Germanicus was going to do this or not is anyone's guess, because he didn't get a chance to get that far. He was assassinated when he was abroad, probably by the leader of the time, Tiberius. When he was assassinated, his wife carried his ashes, because the Romans practiced cremation, back to Rome by way of the port city of Brundisi, which you see here. Brundisium is what it's called in the title. And she is carrying that urn in her hand. If you follow my cursor, she's right in the center here, carrying that urn with her two children beside her and her family behind her as well. So that's our subject, right? This is a grand subject. This is a powerful ancient Roman story, perfectly appropriate to the grand manner style. So then, how does it idealize things? How is it idealized? Let's try to find some of those stylistics in here. I'm not going to do all of it because this would be doing your work for you, but I do want to show you how this works. So where did we start? We started with the idea that in classical works of art, everything needs to be idealized because idealized form is a manifestation of the divine and of truth and goodness as well. The idealization, if we were to go through here and measure out all of these human forms, particularly the male forms, they are all based upon canons of proportions, perfect proportionality. Number two, remember how I said that everything in a work of art that is classical is meant to appeal to the mind rather than the emotions, and that shows up in various ways? Look at the emotions that they have. They're all somber and sorrowful, but no one's pulling their hair out. No one's crying uncontrollably. They have restrained emotions, right? They're acting rationally. Again, in clarity, order, and rationality. Is there a place that your eye keeps going in this work of art over and over again? And the answer should be yes. This group in the center is the most brightly lit, especially Agrippina herself. There are a lot of implied lines, including this pointing gesture by the man pointing to her, lots of implied lines by people looking at her that make us look at her first. So a very ordered picture that says, here's what's called the focal point, the place that we focus first. And then once you look at her, You look at the rest of the characters in this group that mirror her, right? One after another, we get to here, and it moves us out to these figures, or over here, and moves us out to these figures. We really focus in on what's called the foreground first, which leads me to my next point. There's a clear differentiation of foreground, all these figures here, and then the middle ground, this building here, and then the deep background that's rendered in atmospheric perspective way back here. There's also a balancing, not quite a symmetry, but balancing. If I split this down the middle of the picture, you see balance on this side with the mass against the buildings over here, brighter colors over here, more muted colors over here, right? Almost equal weight on both sides of the picture. Notice too, and again, it's going to be hard for some of you to see this, but this work does use linear one-point perspective. All of these flagstones down here, if you can barely see the lines, they all recede to a central vanishing point back here. So he's using linear one-point perspective to render the space. Now, linear one-point perspective isn't the way we actually see the world. It's like a mathematical perfect space that underlies all of the space that you see in this picture. It's even used up here. If you see these lines of the building, if you followed them down with a ruler, they're all going to end up somewhere right here. That is the vanishing point, right down here, the vanishing point. Up here, vanishing point, right? So in other words, if you were to set a ruler on the edge of these buildings up here or on the flagstones, they're all going to go to the same vanishing point. That's linear perspective. How about the colors? Colors are either primaries or things that blend together, so analogous colors. That's some of it, right? You can go find other stylistics by thinking about those terms and trying to apply them here. But I want to move on to some of the other ideas that I said were part of the grand manner. Remember how I said that it has to have a moral lesson? Well, what is the moral lesson of this? The answer has to do with what Agrippina, the wife of Germanicus, does next. See, when Benjamin West was trying to come up with a subject, he actually consulted a lot of people about what would be an appropriate subject at this time in England. And one of the people that he consulted was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, so a religious figure, who said, frankly, you know, in England, apparently at this time, during the reign of George III, this religious leader thought there was far too much adultery, that people were remaining faithful to their husbands and their wives, and they need to be taught a moral lesson. In this story, what happens is that Agrippina becomes a widow here. In Roman times, it's completely appropriate for widows to remarry, but she refuses to remarry, even though she's very, very viable. Everyone's courting her. After all, she's rich, she's attractive, she's got the support of Germanicus's, one thinks, armies on her side and so forth. So she is sought after, but she chooses to remain faithful to her husband even in his death. Something known as conjugal fidelity. So the moral message of this is conjugal fidelity. Further on, she teaches this to at least one of her kids. This younger kid here, the girl, is Agrippina the Younger. She's actually the mother of Nero, if you know him. She tries to talk Nero out of divorcing his wife and remarrying. I think he has her assassinated, if I remember correctly, so it doesn't work so well for her, but her values are instilled in her daughter. I don't know what happened in this case. For those of you who don't know, her other child was Caligula. Maybe it's a kind of the trauma of patricide, but if you don't know about Caligula, things go horribly wrong for him. He's basically a Roman psychopath, so if you're curious, Google him. In any case, that's our moral message, conjugal fidelity. The final thing is archaeological accuracy. And again, I'm not going to belabor this for an intro class, but you need to know that, for instance, this central grouping of figures here, Agrippina and the retinue of her family returning with the ashes of Germanicus, is a slightly modified copy of not a painting, but a sculpture from Roman times called the Areopagus Auguste, or just the Areopagus. Some of you will have seen this before if you've taken an early art history class. It's a major monument created to extol the virtues of Octavian Augustus, or Caesar Augustus as he was known. It's a big kind of, almost like a building with relief sculpture, meaning sculpture carved into the surface of marble all the way around it. And one of the things that is a part of that sculpture is a series of depictions of these important, powerful Roman families, because Augustus actually promoted family values in Rome at this time. So he depicts all of these very harmonious families on the exterior of this monument. And what's happened here is that Benjamin West, seeking to draw parallels between his time in ancient Rome and to make sure that his work is archaeologically accurate, has basically kind of copied a little group of those patricians, as they're known, families, and slightly modified it to fit it in this work. That's archaeologically accurate, quoting an earlier classical work of art. The other place that archaeological accuracy really shows up here is in the boats that are based upon precedents of Roman boats, descriptions of them, and finally this building back here. The building is a depiction of Diocletian's palaces at Spalatro. These were buildings, by the way, that were, of course, destroyed and in ruins at this time, but there was a famous English engraver who made a boatload of money traveling around the ancient world, creating reconstructive drawings that were then turned into prints and sold as subscriptions to people who are interested in the ancient world. This man's name is Robert Adams, for those of you who care. And this is based upon his reconstructive engraving of Diocletian's palaces at Spalatro. So let's move on to a subject that's more, remember, Benjamin West is an American artist, but he's primarily painting in Europe. He did paint scenes, though, things that happened in North America, including one of his most famous works that you see here, which is called The Death of General Wolfe. Now, in The Death of General Wolfe, since we've already covered some of these ideas, I'm going to go over it a little bit more quickly. First of all, the subject is a grand subject. It's the death of a heroic man in battles that were taking place in North America between the French and the English. Now, as your text points out, these battles, these conflicts between France and England, and by also extension Spain and England and France and so forth, will go on for a long time to come. In their manifestations in North America, we tend to call these, as people of the U.S., the French-Indian Wars, because both sides, by the way, used Native American groups to bolster their soldier retinues. But in England, they call this the 7 Years' War, right? And this is just one manifestation. In any case, what you're looking at here is a particular battle over the city of Quebec that took place between the British and the French, where the British won, but they also lost their greatest general, General Wolfe, who we see here dying in front of us. So you've got a grand subject, right? A big heroic history scene. But one of the things that's a little odd here, or new, that you wouldn't know about, many of you, is that it's a fairly contemporary scene. Most of the time, classical artists will show you a historical scene, something that took place way back in ancient Greece or Rome or biblical times and so forth. Here we have something that took place about 10 years before he painted this. So we've got that powerful subject. Now, how is it idealized? Well, again, I'm going to leave a lot of this up to you, but I'm going to point out a couple of things that are new from the last one. Right in the center, we have a focal point again, right? How is he the focal point? Well, let me take you through it. He is the most illuminated figure. The light source shines directly on him. That, by the way, is symbolic. Light is symbolic of God, and so light shining on him would tell you God shines his favor on this man. Further, he's right in the center of the picture. Another thing that makes him the focal point is look at all these implied lines of the figures looking or pointing at him. That's going to make us look there as well. And then finally, notice how he has his own personal space. Only one person, the surgeon over here, overlaps him. Otherwise, he is open to us, whereas most other characters get overlapped in some way. So that makes him the focal point, right? It hierarchizes the way that we look at this picture. We look at this grouping first, and then we look off to the sides, stay in the foreground. How is it idealized? If we were to go through here and measure all the bodies, they will all be submitted to some degree to a canon of proportions. As a matter of fact, this Native American in the foreground, and Iroquois, probably a member of the Mohawk tribe, is rendered in perfect proportionality. The artist actually looked at ancient Roman sculptures and copied their form so as to create this form of the Native American over here, to idealize that human body, right? To make these things God-like. Going further from that, again, we've got a stable composition that uses balancing, kind of equal weight on both sides, has a clear foreground, then a middle ground, and you can barely see a deep background back here. That further uses a pyramidal form or a triangular composition in the center to add stability here, right? And then think about the use of color, think about the emphasis on sharp lines on the figures, and how all of those add up to the grand manner style as well. Archaeological accuracy in here. Benjamin West, and this is actually where he got in trouble, in coming up with this picture almost 10 years after the event occurred, had models wear the uniforms that would have been worn in this part of the world at this time in order to make sure he had it correct. That's the big thing that is archaeologically accurate. He's trying to be somewhat accurate with the depiction of this Iroquois man, the Mohawk, probably, by getting his hairstyle right. The body tattooing markings are a little bit fictitious and primarily based upon people like Theodore de Bry's, interest in body markings of Native Americans that is, let's say, inspired by what they were doing to their bodies, but not always accurate to what they were doing. Then the moral lesson. Can you get it? The moral lesson is, and it's very rational, this man has died for his country. This man has sacrificed himself for his country. And that is, again, sacrificing for the greater good rather than being caught up in one's own personal pursuits. I want to draw attention to something else here, and I'll go back and forth on this. This is something that's tricky to talk about in works of art, but they happen all the time. This is what's known as an allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. The figure of General Wolfe expiring down below is copied from or adapted from pictures of what are known as pietas, or lamentation scenes, pictures of Jesus Christ dying oftentimes on his mother's lap, which you see above here. You don't need to know who the artist is, who created that work of art, but he's obviously looked at earlier scenes of Jesus dying and copied the body pose of those scenes for his own picture. Now, why would he do that? You can probably get it, right? He is visually corresponding General Wolfe with Jesus to say, just as Jesus sacrificed for the betterment of mankind, so General Wolfe sacrificed for England in this case. There's a ton else that I could talk about, but I can talk about a million things in these pictures forever, and then you'd have, 8-hour-long lectures, so let's not do that. Let's talk about one final big thing here, which is over here, in the representation of the Native American, we have another example, though now very firmly an example of what's known as the noble savage. The idea of the noble savage is actually an adaptation of a kind of romantic philosopher's idea, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who once said that all human beings are born into the world innately noble. But unfortunately, civilization can be a corrupting force for them, And the more that they age and the more that they grow, civilization can also oftentimes force them to do things that are not very noble, that are wrong. The way that this gets adapted to a stereotype of Native Americans is like this. It says that Native Americans are innately noble. They're good at heart, right? Unfortunately, and this is where it changes what Rousseau said, unfortunately, they haven't been taught the right way to act in the world. They need to be, according to this philosophy, civilized and given religion. Never mind the fact that they already had their own form of civilization and their own spiritual traditions. Europeans thought it's up to us to foster this civilizing tendency in them, because otherwise they will be savages. This whole philosophy of the noble savage is based upon the premise that they are, on the one hand, noble, on the other hand, prone to savagery, which is in turn based upon this kind of almost social Darwinism that says something like, and they really believe this, that Native Americans or American Indians are at an earlier form of societal evolution, way back in the savage form, and that we can teach them and bring them along and really kind of speed up their social evolution by giving them language, giving them history, giving them our culture, our civilization, and oftentimes, of course, giving them our religion. How is that seen here? Well, it has to do with this pose. The hand on the chin is a typical pose of a philosopher or a thinker. Here we have this Native American who's thinking about the sacrifice of General Wolfe, and he's learning from him. This is the right way to act. Now, I want you to notice what kind of a relationship this sets up between white European colonizers and their understanding of Native Americans. What it basically says is something like, Native Americans are like children. They're good, but they need to be taught, and our way is better than their way. Their way is backwards and, associated with an earlier form of evolution. It's savage. We need to teach them our way. It gives us, Europeans, a paternalistic relationship to Native Americans, as if we're the ones that need to teach them, that it's almost our duty to teach them. Final thing I wanted to say about this is I told you that he got in trouble for his archaeological accuracy here. This is a weird one, but he, in depicting these figures in contemporary clothing, broke a cardinal rule of classical aesthetics at this time, which is timelessness. Because they're all dressed in everyday kind of clothes of the British Army from 10 years earlier, this made it time constrained. It was associated with a particular moment of time. And if you're wondering what the hell should they have been wearing to not break this rule, the answer is togas, man. Everyone was supposed to be wearing togas or be nude or wear some nondescript ancient classical garb in classical works of art. And if you think this is a minor thing, it wasn't. The president of the Royal Academy of the time, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and George III came out publicly and criticized Benjamin West's work here. But the public in the end liked it so much that a year later, George III and Sir Joshua Reynolds both apologized. And frankly, Benjamin West set a new kind of rule for classical aesthetics, which is it's okay to have clothing that is more contemporaneous as long as the moral lesson that's being taught is universal and timeless. Just very briefly then, one final work by Benjamin West. Again, I will be focusing in on key works of art in these lectures, but other works of art that I show you, I just want you to know that they're out there and give you a sense of, how to understand these works of art in relation to the artist. This is Penn's Treaty with the Indians from a little bit later, 1771 to 72. Benjamin West oftentimes would paint scenes of Native Americans or American history. He was proud of his American heritage, and frankly, a lot of the public were really interested in Europe at the time in seeing Native Americans. We saw this in our first lecture. And so what we see here, of course, is this key moment in which the Quaker culture of William Penn is in, this one of the earliest of settlements, is creating a treaty with the Native American cultures of this time. So it's a history painting about this moment. And again, all of the things that we've talked about before are at play here. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, this happens sometimes in an online lecture. I want to go back here for a moment here and just say, we talked about this before, but in Agrippina landing at Brundisium, if you're wondering why all these figures in the center are painted in gray tones, or what's called grisaille, that's so that people would be able to recognize it had been lifted from a sculpture, right? A reference to the Areopagus Augustae. Sorry about that. So back to this work, the focal point, once again, right in the center, the unfolding of trade goods that are going to be the basis of these treaties that were going on, focuses on this interaction, very peaceable interaction between colonizers, which again, or settlers as they would have been known at this time, and the native populations, right? That it was all peaceful, it minimizes any conflict. It's being painted at a time where there's increasing conflicts, by the way, between Native American groups and, colonial Americans, but that's being toned down, and that's probably on purpose. As your text points out, what Benjamin West may have been wanting to do, because his family, by the way, were very important people in Pennsylvania at this time, and frankly, this over here on the far left-hand side, leaning against this box, might even be a self-portrait of West. His father is probably represented back here, and his stepbrother or half-brother over here as well. What he may have been wanting to say is, remember how we used to get along. Remember how we used to treat each other at a time that there was increasing conflicts between Native Americans and colonial Americans. So then, very quickly, I want to go through some of the most. So as I said, Benjamin West is working in England. A lot of artists went to study under him. This is a return to Charles Willson Peale, who we saw last time, who went to study under Benjamin West as well and tried to import some of that classical style to the United States. Now, Charles Willson Peale was fairly successful, but primarily because he didn't really go full throttle into classical aesthetics. What he did is he took some ideas that he learned from classicism, and primarily he went for the technique that he learned to paint. And he tried to paint various scenes of important, primarily these are portraits, important figures in American history. The most popular early hero, of course, in American painting and sculpture, the one that was kind of the face of the nation. Every household, by the way, had little cameo pictures of this man, was George Washington. And what we see here is Charles Willson Peale's painting from 1779, somewhere around there, of George Washington as a commander, right? Now, I could go into this in detail and talk. Well, let's do a little bit of this. What he's trying to do is create a heroic portrait of this major leader, but he's not doing a very good job of it. He uses some standard classical devices. For instance, George Washington putting his hand on this cannon to show that he was a leader of a powerful army, or putting a horse behind him. If you've seen a lot of those equestrian monuments of great leaders riding a horse, it goes all the way back to Roman times. The iconography of that is that just as a leader leads his horse, he leads his people and he leads his armies. So in other words, a good horseman shows that he's a good leader. So we've got a horse back here in the background to make that reference to it. It doesn't work very well, though, it seems to me, because the proportionality of George Washington that clearly Charles Willson Peale, having only had about a year of study under Benjamin West, hasn't really gotten it right? George Washington looks like he has this tiny little head. There's probably about 9 heads to this body, which is not really according to classical principles. He's trying to make George Washington look kind of casual. So he's got his knee across the other knee and leaning over there. So it doesn't really come across as heroic. But here's the thing. Charles Willson Peale, of course, as I said last time, actually served under George Washington. So this may be very well the way that he appeared to his men, or someone who had firsthand experience of him would have thought of him. It's not the one that sticks, though. It's not the one that ends up on the dollar bill, is it? So a few more of these, just to, again, go through this very quickly. Charles Wilson Peel's Washington General Lafayette, who, of course, was a French leader, the Marquis de Lafayette, who helped us out in the Revolutionary War, and General Tilghman at Yorktown, which, of course, is a major battle and the signing of the armistice. Or here, a head of George Washington, also, this is at Princeton, also by Benjamin West, right? Look at that face. That's probably more what George Washington looked like, but it's not the one that really sticks in the imagination as this is the leader and the founder of this country, and it's not the one that we ended up putting on the dollar bill. Again, another portrait of George Washington here by Charles Wilson Peele. I could bring in, by the way, 30 more of these, both by Peele and by his children, which, as you know, were also artists, but I'm not going to belabor the point. I will, however, say that a ton of artists tried their hand at George Washington, and the one that finally really got it right, so to speak, the one that created an image, a representation of George Washington that captured the public imagination and became the image that we associate with George Washington, is this artist here. This is Gilbert Stuart, and what you're looking at here is the Vaughan portrait of George Washington from about 1795 to 96. This isn't the one that really stuck, but Gilbert Stuart, who also went to Europe to study, first in France and then under Benjamin West, was a very good painter, sat with George Washington a number of times until he got it right. The names of these portraits, by the way, the Vaughan portrait here, are based upon early owners of these portraits. So he looks stately. He looks, animated in a way. He looks like someone who you can imagine being serious in a way that this guy just looks like an everyday Joe, right? The fact that he looks out at us, that our eye level is slightly below his, so he seems to have some power over us. These are all devices to make him look more monumental, more full of power. This is the one that, of course, stuck. This is George Washington, the Athenaeum, as it's known, from 1796. And actually the picture that, once he got this kind of sketchy picture done, he's like, oh, I nailed it. This is the George Washington that everyone's going to remember. And this is the basis of a series of portraits he'll do from this point forward. And pretty much artists after this will just copy this portrait of George Washington over and over and over again. There's Martha, too, over on the right-hand side. In the same sitting, he sat with them and came up with these two iconic portraits of the First Lady and George Washington himself, right? And so then he went on, and other artists went on to copy this over and over and over again, including his famous, more complicated portrait of George Washington where he's taken that head and put it on a body now. This is known as the Lansdowne portrait from 1796. As your reading points out in this portrait of George Washington, basically we've just taken that head, stuck it on this body, and we filled it up with a whole bunch of iconography that is associated with great leaders of the past. The first one is that he's just stepped out of his chair. It's not quite a throne, but you're supposed to be recalling thrones of past great leaders, not in terms of a king, but in terms of a leader. And on that chair, you see the stars and stripes, the actual flag here in this area, and he's addressing the nation. This is the way that a Republican Roman leader would address the nation. And Republican Rome was a big idea in the heads of a lot of early leaders. See, Republican Rome is Rome before it became an empire. And in Republican Rome, which was a representative democracy, we had senators and we had representatives for what was called the plebeian class, the lower classes, that would get together and decide, make decisions about things. And of course, the United States founded its houses of Congress on that Republican Roman system with a Senate and with a House of Representatives, right? So making reference to that period with someone standing and addressing the crowd the way that a senator would address Roman crowds is what's happening here. And he's actually drawing from earlier precedents in Roman sculptures, for instance. On the table, we see it's all a matter of diplomacy, that he's got a writing quill and papers here. Below, by the way, we've got some very important books down here. The big one that I want you to remember is The Federalist, which is, of course, one of the founding documents that led to the creation of, or the philosophy behind the creation of the Constitution. But, of course, every once in a while you're going to need military might, so he's got in his other hand a sword, although that's not really being emphasized, is it? This hand over here, hovering next to the diplomacy department or the writing department, is paramount here. Further on, you see the bald eagle here above this stylized leg of a table that's in the shape of arrows. We actually lifted that from Native American culture. It's a symbol of unity. The bald eagle, of course, ends up being the national bird. And those arrows, if you were to count them out, there would probably be 13 there, represent the 13 original colonies. One of the most famous sculptures of George Washington is also one of the earliest, most controversial ones. This was created actually by a French artist by the name of Jean-Antoine Houdon. But we're going to include it in this lecture on American artists because it's such a part of the American tradition. You see it here in its current place, where you can see it on exhibition in the Virginia State House, even though it was originally commissioned for the U.S. Senate Rotunda building. And actually, originally, Thomas Jefferson, who at the time that this was created was the minister of France, kind of like, you know, an ambassador to France would be these days, had this the most famous French portrait sculptor come to the United States and sit with George Washington a couple of times and then talk with Thomas Jefferson and others to create the sculpture. The problem was, in the end, because of infighting between Thomas Jefferson and other senators, and because this style not really matching up to the way that a lot of Americans thought of George Washington, it wasn't accepted. They turned down and wouldn't pay for the commission, so Thomas Jefferson had to come up with funds to buy it, and that's why it's in Virginia right now. So let's talk about what we're looking at here. The artist Houdon comes to the United States. He sits with George Washington. He actually creates what's known as a life mask, or sometimes they call this a death mask of George Washington. So if you've ever wanted to know what he really looks like, here's what it looks like. It's an actual plaster cast of his face. Then he uses that cast in order to render this form a little bit more idealistically. But he's talked with Thomas Jefferson about it, and while he wants to fill this up with classical iconography or symbolism, he also wants to get the representation of George Washington accurate. And by accurate, I mean what George Washington meant to people in the United States. The first thing that he meant to everyone was he was a great leader who was everyday in some aspects and in other aspects was exceptional. That he was like everyone else, but he worked just a little bit harder and was just a little bit better. That he was an everyday guy, in other words, but he had qualities to them which everyday people aspired to. He was like us, and yet he was better than us. And that's in this sculpture. The first place you see it is in what he's wearing. The clothing that he's wearing is associated, again, with the mercantile class, the trading class. It's not actually a uniform. It's a overcoat underneath over an undercoat or a half coat here, in which on the corners, on his shoulders, you have epaulettes, and that's the only thing that associates him with military command. In other words, In other words, he's just a everyday merchant class man who, when called upon to serve his country, served his country with honor. This was a big idea in the United States at the time. Remember, we didn't have a standing army. We had a militia, the Minutemen, people who were citizen soldiers who, when called upon, would sacrifice for the United States, just like George Washington here. Another idea that was associated with George Washington was that he wasn't elitist. He didn't care, for instance, about how he looked so much. His hair, while it looks like one of those powdered English wigs, is not a wig at all. He wouldn't affect that kind of pompous attitude of the English. He also didn't care apparently much about how he dressed, which was something associated with English elitism. So if you follow my cursor here, you'll see on the outer coat here, button, 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 and then one's missing. Well, it's not actually missing. He just forgot to button it, kind of like an old man buttoning up his shirt in a misaligned way. And this is, again, the sculptor trying to show us something about how George Washington doesn't care so much about how he looks. The big symbolism, though, is here, and you can barely see it under the undercoat. This little dot that you see down here, if you're looking at it from another angle, is actually a badge. And that badge is something known as the badge of the Fraternity of Cincinnatus. So stick with me here. Cincinnatus was originally a Roman general who, like George Washington and many other military personnel in the Revolutionary War, gave up his commission because he preferred to farm. He preferred the simple life. Now, George Washington, of course, got done with his command. They had to talk him into being the first president, which, by the way, took a long time to get him into that office. And then, of course, after 2 terms, he said, that's it. I want to go farm for the remainder of my life. I want to get back to the simple life. This is a symbol of people who don't aspire to power, a symbol of people who are innately noble. You see, farming was seen as the noblest of the ministries, something that someone would do working with their hands in the land to provide food for the rest of us. You couldn't get a more noble pastime. By the way, early Americans thought banking was like the least noble thing you could do because it was making money off of money. So that's something that everyone loved about George Washington, right? And it's all there in the symbolism. I said that the Order of Cincinnatus ended up being a fraternity in the United States of a number of former military personnel who also gave up their commissions to do their simple everyday calling. And they belonged to this order called the Order of Cincinnatus. And this badge is a little recognition of that. Finally, this bundle of things over here, these rods that you see bundled together are a reference to Republican Rome. In Republican Rome, representatives of various constituencies were given these rods. They're basically a symbol of the right to vote for their constituency, right? They're what are known as fasces. It's the root word to fascism, but it's not really the same thing. And when Republican Roman leaders would be called for an important vote to Rome, they would carry these with them to Rome to show that they had the power to vote for their constituency, and then all of them would bundle them together as if to say, we're all independent parts of Rome, and we're going to respect that independence, but we're also a unified Rome. You can probably guess how many fasces are here. There are exactly 13. Further on the back of this, you see his sword and his shield hung up, and a plowshare, which is the front of a plow used to plow the ground, behind that. That's another symbolism of, again, him giving up the military to do the simple, noble pastime or vocation of farming. Now, when I said before this was turned down, when this was presented to the senators who had commissioned this work, supposedly, they didn't get it, right? They They were being told all of this iconography. In particular, they had a problem with these fasces and the reference back to Republican Rome. This is very closely associated with Thomas Jefferson, but they saw it as too European. This language was too European, too elitist. Who knew about these stories from Republican Rome? That's something that Europeans care about, not us. We don't want our George Washington represented that way, and they turned down the commission. They wouldn't pay for it. So again, this is something that spurs a lot of representations of George Washington. This is just another artist who is representing George Washington here. Here's another. If you think they hated that one, this is Horatio Greenough's representation or sculpture of George Washington. Horatio Greenough, by the way, like many of these artists, traveled to Europe to learn how to become a sculptor. There's no classes on sculpture here. We didn't even have the marble to do it. So he went to Rome to study. He learned about classical aesthetics and the idea that the nude human body, when made perfect, was in the image of God. And thus, when you looked at that perfect nude male body, you were saying something like, this man is God-like. And then he applied it to George Washington, which you see here. George Washington looks like some kind of Greek or Roman god, pointing up to heaven and turning over his sword. But again, for people of the time, this language of classical art was European. It was elitist. It was not something that Americans were, and they really didn't like it much. Right? Or, for instance, Giuseppe Carracci's work. He was an Italian immigrant, came to the United States, learned his trade in Rome to sculpt, and created this sculpture of George Washington. And if you're thinking, wow, this looks strangely familiar, it's because George Washington here is a Roman Caesar. And again, he's drawing this allusion to great Roman leaders, but Americans weren't having it. George Washington turned up everywhere, right? So I just wanted to show you this everywhere. Little cameos, little simple pictures, even turning up on pottery, because he was this first greatest of American heroes. And when we were searching for an image that united us all, that said this is what we aspired to, when it came to historical leaders, this was the guy. Again, I'm going to pause here for a minute. This will be part one of this lecture. And then I'll come back with part two and talk a little bit about some of the other painters who were more associated with painting in the United States itself.